Good evening, students. Today we will be discussing the last stage of the French Revolution, stage 4. So please continue the notes in your composition book and be prepared to discuss tomorrow. So please take notes again in the following format as the stage of the revolution. This is stage 4, the recovery stage. During the lecture, please record the information as it fits into each of the categories. A slow, uneven return to quieter times, a rule by a tyrant, radicals repressed, moderates gain amnesty, and aggressive nationalism. Each section will be noted at the top of the slide of where it began or belongs, so please be on the lookout for that. So step 1, a return to a quieter time. So the Constitution of year 3 of the Republic, 1795. Now, the French government, with the help of Napoleon Bonaparte, was able to vanquish most of their foreign invaders. They were able to stop the reign of terror, and the convention was finally able to inaugurate its new constitution. In year 3, 1795, it created a new constitution called the Directory. The government under the Directory would be broken down into what we refer to as a republic or a representative democracy. Starting with the legislature, there would be 500 members in a lower house who would propose laws and 250 members in an upper house who would vote on the laws. 2/3 of the legislature would be initially filled by members of the National Convention. The only qualifications that you would have, where you would have to be a Girondist or a middle-class party that would defeated the Jacobins, essentially would be the working-class peasant party. The Girondist constitution stated that suffrage, or the right to vote, as well as the right to hold office, would be limited only to property owners, however. The legislature would go on to appoint an executive branch member, and there would be 5 different directors of the executive branch. Thus, there would not be power consolidated in any particular person's control. So some of the most important laws and reforms passed by the convention would include adopting the metric system, finally abolishing what we would call feudalism, or a system of the oldest son inheriting all of the father's estate. They would also draw up a comprehensive system of laws to deal with basically everything from freedom of speech to voting. They ended debtors' prisons, which basically said that you would have to go to prison if you owed somebody money. They ended slavery in France's colonies, making France the very first major empire in the world to end slavery. And they would establish a first nationwide system of public education, putting the French on a very the forefront of liberal reforms within the European continent. Now, like with many fledgling democracies, the Directory certainly had some problems. The biggest one was corruption and poor administration. Essentially spread across 5 people, that gives a lot of people an attempt to jockey for position, one seeking power over the other, and it gives a lot of opportunities for corruption. On this note, the French were going poor because they were still paying taxes, but they were not getting anything out of the government. And this grew to have a lot more frustration with the government. The one place where the French were actually doing well was in military victories, where they were still being successful against many of the opponents around the continent of Europe. This led to an outbreak of nationalism or pride in the French country. And because of this, a French corporal by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte would be able to launch what we would refer to as a coup d'etat, or a blow to the state, which essentially would be where he would seize power and stop the French Revolution by declaring himself the dictator of France. And this would end the 10-year period known as the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799, where Napoleon would become the first consul of France. This brings us to step two for stage four of the revolution: rule by a tyrant. Napoleon would rule France as a tyrant with an iron fist. However, he is not as short as everybody else thought. He was actually 5'7". His shortness was propaganda by the British. So it's important to know a little bit about Napoleon. Number one, he was born on the island of Corsica, which is, although it was owned by France, it was actually, the people of Corsica are of Italian descent, and he had kind of a meteoric rise in the French military. He was already serving by 1789 at the start of the revolution, and in fact, he saw, as a member of the French military, the storming of the Bastille when he was 17 years old. Now he earns fame for capturing Toulon from the British, and he's promoted to brigadier general. He then earns even more fame by crushing rebels that opposed the National Convention in 1795. In 1797, he becomes the commander-in-chief of the army of Italy and wins victories against both Austria and the King of Sardinia. However, he does lose horribly to the British in the Middle East, in Egypt and Syria. But in the end, after he comes back from Egypt and Syria, he's able to overthrow the Directory and becomes the first consul of France, and in 1804 declares himself Emperor of France. Now we come to the government under Napoleon that we would know as step three. So first off, Napoleon consolidated his power by strengthening the central government. He created a strong bureaucracy. This bureaucracy would be centralized on order, security, and efficiency that would replace the liberty, equality, and fraternity as of the revolution. He instituted a number of new reforms to restore economic prosperity, controlling prices of grain, using government funds to build roads and canals to bring the country together, creating a public school system called the lycées, and encouraging the émergés, or the nobles, to come back into France and to invest their money back into France. But most importantly of all, he developed a new law code that was called the Napoleonic Code. This took a lot of the ideas from the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen and brought them into a stable government. These included equality for all citizens, the end of feudal tithe, religious toleration, and advancement based solely on your skills and merit as a person and not the title or the family in which you came from. In this way, Napoleon kept a lot of the spirit of the revolution, but the thing that he did away with was the chaos, the blood, and the disorder. He brought the ideas of the revolution into his dictatorship. So Napoleon would go on not to just be satisfied with controlling France. He also wanted to control most of Europe. He would go on to build a massive empire, annexing and outright adding territories to France from neighboring countries, getting rid of the Holy Roman Empire and enveloping that into his own country. He would also eventually marry into the Austrian royal family, cutting the country of Prussia in half and taking territory. He would control most of Europe through force, but he would also control it through forceful diplomacy, putting friends and relatives on the throne of European countries and forcing alliances with many European powers under the threat of his armies marching on their capital cities. Napoleon was very effective at getting what he wanted. Now, the only country that really maintained outside of Napoleon's grasp was the British. And this became a point of national pride for the French to fight the British, and sometimes to their own undoing. Napoleon wanted to try to control the British, but unfortunately, he was smacked down by England's most powerful force, their navy. The preeminent battle was the Battle of Trafalgar, where Napoleon's navy was destroyed by Admiral Horatio Nelson. And was unable to try to conquer England. This made Napoleon turn back towards the continent of Europe and develop something called the continental system, which forbade European nations from trading with England in an attempt to starve out England. But again, England had a very formidable navy, and they were very much easily able to evade the blockades of the continental system and trade wherever and whenever they wanted with European powers. Although he would never control England, Napoleon still built the largest land empire on the continent of Europe, either through outright control of states or control of states through alliances with friendly kings. This was the biggest land empire in Europe since the Roman Empire. As you can see, the extent of his empire by 1812. Building an empire is an act of aggressive nationalism. However, there were some major issues with this because while people became proud to be French and they were happy with the ideas of the revolution, they saw Napoleon's foreign armies and their invasions as essentially an oppressive force on their own countries. Now, Napoleon encountered his first real resistance in Spain, where eventually Napoleon would go on to replace the Spanish king with his own brother. But what happened was that instead of people accepting Napoleon's brother, he encountered constant guerrilla warfare and what we would call the Peninsular Campaign. And eventually this would help drain France of many of its resources. The lack of success in Spain spelled the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Essentially, what it did was inspire other countries to resist Napoleon because they saw what could happen in Spain. Austria began to resist and resume hostilities against Napoleon, but the biggest one was that Russia decided that it was going to resist Napoleon. Now, Napoleon would go on to try to invade Russia, but unfortunately for him, he did not take into account the Russian winter, which unfortunately for Napoleon was a much bigger drain and killer of his men than any army could possibly be. After his campaign, which was essentially successful in Russia, the retreat out of the Russian countryside would cost Napoleon nearly 410,000 soldiers, roughly 95% of his entire army, and would die on the retreat from Russia. Just as Napoleon's rise to power was dramatic, so was his fall. Essentially, the defeat in Russia spelled Napoleon's doom. Smelling blood in the water, Russia, Britain, Austria, and Prussia formed a new alliance against the weakened France. The first battle that Napoleon would see after Russia was the Battle of Leipzig, which was part of the Sixth Coalition War. Napoleon's army was incredibly depleted after Russia. Therefore, everybody who was fighting was basically new recruits, untested and untried by fire, and he was routed by the coalition forces. After this, the coalition marches on Paris and forces Napoleon to abdicate the throne or step down. At this point, he is arrested and he is sent to the island of Elba, which is a tiny island in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Italy. Now, in 1815, Napoleon escapes from his exile and returns to France, and this is the start of something that we call the 100 Days. He regains the throne of France and immediately goes to fight his old nemesis, the English, in Belgium. This time, Napoleon is finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, which is basically the downfall of him entirely. Napoleon is then forced to abdicate one more time. This time he is kicked out to the island of St. Helena, which is the South Atlantic Ocean, south of Africa, where he dies of stomach cancer in 1821. Now, Napoleon meant a lot to the French Revolution. Number one, basically, he made the revolution a legitimate action, getting rid of the Bourbons. Without him, the revolution would have probably crashed and burned. So his biggest legacy is the Napoleonic Code, which took many of the changes from the revolution and made them permanent. Secondly, he turned France into a centralized state with an actual constitution where people's rights would be protected. He expanded suffrage and he expanded elections through France, although there would still be white males with property. Many citizens would have more property rights and access to education. The French citizens lost many of these rights, but in the end, they were happy to exchange some rights that they earned from the revolution for security. On the world stage, Napoleon's conquest would spread his idea of revolution and nationalism throughout the rest of the Western world. He did fail to make France into a lasting French empire, but nonetheless, he did make it a formidable power. He abolished the Holy Roman Empire and would eventually contribute to the creation of a new country called Germany. And then lastly, helping the United States, he sold the Louisiana Territory, doubling the size of the American country. Please check back in with the stages of revolution to make sure that you have information in each category. Write down any questions that you have for Mr. Wilson that he can ask tomorrow. Thank you. Lastly, answer this question below your notes. Was the French Revolution successful? Why or why not? Please use information from the text.